There are places in the world that never stop speaking, even when no voices remain inside them. Their walls hold secrets, their floors echo with footsteps that are no longer there, and their corridors stretch on as if time itself refuses to move. Forward. Among these places are the abandoned asylums buildings that once promised safety, treatment, and healing, but instead became prisons of silence, fear, and disappearance. The story of the abandoned asylum is not simply one of brick and mortar falling into ruin. It is a story of people of patience who entered with hope and never left, of families who searched for answers that never came, of doctors whose methods blurred the line between medicine and cruelty, and of governments that chose secrecy over truth. Walk with me, then, through the first hallways of this story. Step carefully, because the silence here is heavy. The plaster is crumbling, the paint peels from the walls like dried skin, and the air smells of dust and forgotten things. But if you listen closely, if you let your imagination wander, you might still hear it. The faint scrape of shoes on tile, the rattle of a gurney wheel, the distant sob of someone who has left behind. It is difficult to explain the feeling of standing in one of these empty institutions. The halls are long, impossibly long, designed so staff could always see who was coming, who was going. The windows are narrow, placed high on the walls, so patients couldn't break the glass or climb out. Sunlight does come in, but it feels strained, like it doesn't belong here, as if even light hesitates to touch these walls. Many of these places were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during a time when society believed that isolation was the cure for madness. Patients were removed from their homes and communities and placed inside sprawling institutions far from city centers. Some of these asylums were vast complexes of hundreds of acres, dozens of buildings, thousands of beds. They were cities unto themselves, with farms, laundries, power plants, even cemeteries. Once a patient entered, there was often no reason to leave. But what did those patients experience? The official story was always one of care. Annual reports boasted of compassionate staff, moral treatment, and modern medicine. Families were told their loved ones were safe. But if you could peel back the glossy reports, you would see something else. Overcrowding, neglect, patients left for hours, even days, strapped to beds. Meals of watery soup and stale bread. In some places, disease spread unchecked. Tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, silent killers moving through wards where patients had no defenses. And then there were the disappearances. Official records rarely spoke of them, but families remembered. They would come to visit only to be told their mother, their brother, their child was no longer here. Sometimes they were told the patient had been transferred, though no record could be found of where. Other times, they were told their loved one had died, but no body was produced, no grave marked. It was as if people had been erased, their existence swallowed by the walls. Imagine being a parent, handing over your troubled child to the state asylum, believing it was the best you could do, only to return months later and be told they were gone, not healed, not released, just gone. When you asked questions, you were given papers stamped, lost, misfiled, transferred. But your heart told you the truth. Something terrible had happened, and no one wanted you to know. Over time, rumors spread. Some whispered of patients buried in unmarked graves behind the institutions. Others told of bodies burned in hospital incinerators, reduced to ash with no records kept. Staff sometimes spoke in hushed voices of wings where patients were sent away and never returned. For decades, these whispers remained whispers. The asylums were closed systems, hidden from the eyes of the public. Few photographs emerged. Fewer reports escaped. The people inside were voiceless, and the people outside were kept in the dark. Today, when we step into these ruins, we feel the weight of those silences. Paint peels from the walls, exposing layers of color green, beige, gray, each layer a different era, a different generation of patience. Graffiti covers some walls now, left by explorers and vandals. But beneath the spray paint are the true marks of the past. Initials scratched into plaster, tally marks carved into window sills, messages hidden in cracks of old wooden doors. Every abandoned asylum is haunted, not necessarily by ghosts, but by memory. The air carries the residue of despair. The architecture itself seems to conspire against you. Hallways stretch longer than they should. Doors don't align properly. Staircases vanish into darkness. Some of this is decay, but some of it feels deliberate, as though the buildings themselves were designed to confuse, to disorient, to trap, standing. There, flashlight in hand, you realize how easy it would be to lose yourself, to take one wrong turn and wander in circles. And maybe that's how it felt for the patients trapped in a world where the way out was always promised but never delivered. But the most disturbing thing is not the emptiness. It is the feeling that the buildings are not empty at all. That something remains. Not something supernatural, but something imprinted, etched into the very materials. Every scream, every sob, every unanswered question pressed itself into the walls. And now those walls whisper back. The silence here is not absence. It is presence. And it forces us to ask a question. What happened to the people who entered these halls and never left? Were they victims of poor record-keeping, lost in bureaucratic neglect? Or were they intentionally erased, hidden away, because their stories were too terrible to tell? This is not just a story of ghosts or folklore. It is a story of human beings, flesh and blood, who lived and suffered in these halls. People whose names were erased from files, whose lives were erased from memory, whose stories were buried beneath dust and decay. In these first silent halls, we don't yet know their names. We don't yet see their faces, but we can feel their absence. We can sense the weight of their vanishing. And we can understand why, decades later, families still ask questions, still seek answers, still refuse to let silence be the final word, because silence in these halls is never empty. It is heavy with everything that has been hidden. And as we move deeper into this story, into the origins of these asylums and the forces that shaped them, one truth becomes clear. The silence of the abandoned asylum is not natural. It is constructed. It was built, brick by brick, policy by policy, decision by decision. It is the sound of lives taken, voices muted, and truths buried. And once you hear it, once you truly let yourself hear it, you cannot unhear it. To understand how these places became what they are today, ruins haunted by silence and mystery, we must return to the beginning. Long before the word asylum became synonymous with fear, it was spoken with hope. In the early 19th century, reformers believed they were building sanctuaries, places of peace, where those suffering from madness could be removed from the chaos of the world and given a chance to heal. This was the age of moral treatment. Doctors and social leaders argued that the mentally ill were not criminals or monsters, but people in need of compassion. They imagined airy wards, wide windows, and green landscapes. Gardens where patients could walk, farms where they could work with their hands, and libraries where they might read and write. It was, in theory, a revolution in care, a turning point from shackles and beatings to dignity and healing. In the beginning, some asylums were built with true care for architecture and environment. The Kirkbride plan, developed in the mid-1800s, called for sprawling wings that branched out like open arms, filled with light and fresh air. These buildings were designed to soothe the mind. Reformers believed that environment itself could heal, but ideals are fragile things. As the decades passed, the vision of the asylum as a place of sanctuary began to crack. Populations grew. Families sent relatives who suffered from melancholy, from epilepsy, from alcoholism. Others were committed for things that today would never be considered illnesses at all. Women suffering postnatal depression, children who struggled to learn, men who simply did not fit the mold of societies. Expectations. With every passing year, the numbers swelled. Soon, asylums that were designed for a few hundred patients housed thousands. Beds lined hallways. Dormitories overflowed. Patients shared mattresses or slept on floors. Nurses were outnumbered 20, 30, even 50 to 1. The fresh air and gardens promised in reform pamphlets turned into locked wards and barred. Windows. The idea of healing was replaced by the grim reality of containment. And in containment, people vanish. Some disappeared into the system itself, their names lost in ledgers. A clerk misspelled a name. A page was torn. A file misplaced. But others seemed to vanish in ways that went beyond bureaucracy. Patients who had been written about in family letters suddenly disappeared from reports. Families who visited regularly were one day told their relative was transferred, but when they asked where, no one could say. The cracks in the system widened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Asylums had become the solution for everything society did not want to face: homelessness, poverty, epilepsy, women who disobeyed, men broken by war. The institutions promised to house them all, and they did, until the weight of so many lives crushed the very ideals they were built upon. Conditions deteriorated. Food became scarce, quality declined. Patients were fed boiled cabbage, stale bread, weak broth. Disease spread quickly through overcrowded wards. Sanitation failed. Doctors prescribed treatments that today sound like torture: insulin comas, forced hydrotherapy, electroshock. In some places, lobotomies were performed as casually as dental cleanings. But in the records of these institutions, one detail is striking: the gaps, pages missing, patient lists with names scratched out, rows of numbers that do not add up, and always the whispers: a patient taken away in the night, a woman's cries echoing down the hall, then silence. A boy who once painted vivid pictures of the asylum garden suddenly gone, his bed filled by another. Staff warned not to ask questions. New patients entered, but some never left. In these early decades, entire families began to notice patterns. A husband committed for depression, never heard from again. A child taken in for hysteria, lost to history. Parents told to stop asking questions or risk being barred from visiting altogether. The truth is that asylums did not simply house people, they erased them. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in subtle, accumulating ways. Some were buried on hospital grounds in unmarked graves. Others, their bodies donated to medical schools without consent. Still others became subjects in experiments never meant to see the light of day. The buildings themselves seemed to conspire in this erasure. They were vast, labyrinthine. Long hallways, multiple wings, basements that stretched beneath the earth like catacombs. It was easy to lose someone in these places, intentionally or not. A patient moved from Ward A to Ward D, then shifted to a basement cell during overcrowding, then nothing, no paper trail. No explanation. By the early 20th century, the word asylum no longer conjured images of gardens and healing. It conjured fear. Fear of being sent there. Fear of being forgotten inside. Newspapers occasionally ran exposes reports of abuse, neglect, overcrowding, but they faded quickly from public memory. Society wanted to look away. The people inside were no longer seen as fully human. They were lunatics, inmates, burdens. And so, when they disappeared, few outside the families noticed, but the families did notice. Letters survived from desperate parents, pleading for news of a child who was transferred and never heard from again. From wives asking where their husbands had gone, why no death certificate existed, why no burial plot could be found. Some families even suspected darker truths, that their loved ones had not simply died, but had been taken for something else. And history gives us reason to believe them, because it was during these very decades that medicine began experimenting. Mental hospitals became testing grounds, and missing patients provided the perfect cover for research that no one was meant to see. The silence of those early asylums is not an accident. It is the sound of absence manufactured, records destroyed, questions deflected, voices silenced. And if you think this is all exaggeration, walk into one of those empty buildings today. Stand in the middle of a hallway 3 stories tall, with paint curling from the walls and a stench of mold rising from the floorboards. You will see doors nailed shut, some with numbers still carved into them. You will see restraints rusted into bed frames, pipes that once carried scalding water into hydrotherapy tubs, and narrow staircases that seemed to lead nowhere at all. You will see cemeteries with rows of stones marked only by numbers, not names. Every missing patient is hidden in those stones, those ledgers, those locked doors. By the mid-20th century, asylums had become a national shame. Reformers who once celebrated them now condemned them. Journalists exposed the horrors. But by then, thousands were already gone. The question remains, gone where? Some undoubtedly died of disease or neglect. Some were buried without ceremony. But others? There? Traces end abruptly, as if they had been deliberately erased. And it is those erasures that give rise to the most chilling possibility, that behind the official history of overcrowding and underfunding, there was another history. One of secrecy, of experiments, of deliberate disappearance. That is where the trail of silence leads. And it is where we must go next. When we speak of people who disappeared inside asylums, we are not talking about rare cases. We are talking about patterns that stretch across states, across decades, across generations. The first reports came quietly. A mother wrote to an institution asking why her son's letters had stopped arriving. The reply was vague. He is being transferred for treatment. Weeks turned into months, and when the family pressed again, they were told he had succumbed to illness. But there was no record of burial, no death certificate, no body returned. Just silence. This same story repeated itself with eerie consistency. Families who visited monthly were told suddenly that visitation was suspended, that their relative was no longer available. Sometimes the explanation was a transfer to another facility. Yet when the family tracked down that facility, the name was nowhere to be found. One surviving letter from 1922 captures the anguish clearly. A father, writing to the superintendent of a New England asylum, pleads, "My daughter has been in your care for 3 years. We received letters from her until last fall, when they ceased. Upon visiting in December, I was told she was moved. I have inquired to the institutions you directed me to, but none have any record of her. I am left to wonder if she still lives. I beg of you, sir, to tell me the truth." No reply was ever recorded. In the margins of asylum ledgers, researchers have found entries crossed out with heavy ink, pages ripped from their bindings. Patient 1487 admitted on June 7th. A note of agitation scrawled in August. Then nothing. The next line skips to patient 1489. Where did 1488 go? Sometimes entire groups of patients vanish together. In the 1930s, a Midwestern asylum reported the sudden transfer of 18 men to an unnamed facility for advanced treatment. Family members who arrived to visit them were told they no longer resided there. When pressed for details, administrators shrugged, claiming the men were moved under state authority. But no official records exist of their transfer. 18 lives. erased in one bureaucratic sweep. The most haunting stories are the ones preserved not in files, but in memory. Former nurses, writing decades later, confessed to unease. One recalled patients being led downstairs late at night, never to return. Another spoke of entire wards being cleared during reorganization, only to be filled with new faces the next week. We cannot dismiss all of these as rumor. Too many align with the missing names and ledgers, the unanswered letters, the gaps in burial records. Take the case of the Harris family. In 1937, their youngest daughter Clara was institutionalized after a nervous breakdown. For 2 years they visited her faithfully, bringing her sweets and knitting supplies. She seemed to improve. Then suddenly they were told she had been transferred for specialized care. When they asked where, they were told the information was confidential. Months later, a letter arrived. Clara had died, but no details were given. The family requested her remains. They were told there were none, that she had been cremated, and the ashes misplaced. The Harris family never received closure. And when researchers searched decades later, they found no death record for Clara Harris at all. How many Claras were there? How many families left bewildered, their grief swallowed by bureaucratic silence? In some cases, the truth began to leak out. During the 1940s, whistleblowers spoke of experiments conducted on patients without consent. Missing individuals, they claimed, were subjects moved to hidden wards or basements where new treatments were tested. Insulin shock, electroconvulsive therapy, deep sleep therapy techniques pushed beyond ethical limits. Some patients survived, altered forever. Others did not. Those who died were quietly erased, their absence explained away as a transfer or a natural death. The horror was not always in the violence of these procedures, but in their invisibility. Society outside the asylum walls rarely asked questions. If a poor man, an immigrant, a woman without family disappeared, who would notice? Who would fight? The asylums relied on this silence. It gave them power. But not everyone was silent. In the 1950s, investigative reporters began to catch wind of these disappearances. A series of articles in local newspapers hinted at unaccounted patients. One journalist claimed that at least 120 names listed as deceased in state records had no corresponding death certificates. The article caused brief outrage, but was quickly buried. The institution denied wrongdoing. The state shrugged. Even so, whispers spread. Families compared stories. Why did so many of their letters go unanswered? Why did so many records contain gaps? Slowly, the realization grew. These were not isolated accidents. Some vanishings left behind chilling traces. A doctor's journal, unearthed decades after his death, contains entries that read like confessions. 2 removed to basement. Ward. Transfer complete, no record. Family notified. Natural causes. A doctor never names the patients, but his notes line up eerily with missing individuals from the same period. And then there were the graveyards. Behind many asylums lie fields dotted with small markers. Some bear numbers, others nothing yet. All patients buried in anonymity, their names stripped away. In some cemeteries, the number of graves exceeds the number of documented deaths, meaning somewhere in those cold plots of earth lie the missing. The vanished patients are not just stories of neglect. They are stories of erasure, deliberate, systematic erasure, the tearing out of pages, the scratching out of names, the vague replies to desperate families. These patterns point to a truth darker than overcrowding or mismanagement. They suggest intention. And when you combine the missing with the whispers of secret experiments, the picture becomes more terrifying still. Patients did not just vanish. They were taken, used. Hidden. Their absence is not simply absence. It is evidence. When you walk the empty halls of these asylums today, you feel it. The weight of all those who vanished. The echoes of their silence. The unspoken question that hovers in every peeling corridor. Where did they go? And that question will guide us into the next part of this story. Because the missing patients may hold the key to understanding what these institutions were hiding. And the truth, when it surfaces, is far worse than anyone imagined. The whispers of vanished patients were terrifying enough. But when investigators began connecting these disappearances to rumors of secret medical trials, the asylum walls grew darker than anyone could have imagined. For years, families suspected. Their loved ones had not simply died or been transferred. They felt something deliberate had happened. The truth, uncovered decades later through scattered files and long-buried testimonies, would confirm those fears. At the heart of the mystery were experiments unofficial, unrecorded, and deeply unethical. It began innocently. Or so the institutions claimed. The early 20th century was an era of experimentation in psychiatry. Doctors sought new methods to cure insanity. Some experimented with diet, others with sensory deprivation, still others with chemicals that could calm or awaken the mind. But somewhere along the line, curiosity turned into cruelty. And the asylum sealed off from public view, filled with the most vulnerable, became the perfect laboratories. One of the earliest scandals involved insulin shock therapy. Patients were deliberately overdosed, forced into comas, sometimes dozens of times. The idea was to reset the brain. Some patients survived barely. Others never woke up. Official records listed these deaths as natural, but internal memos reveal the truth. They were casualties of a dangerous experiment. Electroconvulsive therapy followed. Today, ECT can be carefully administered, but in its infancy, it was brutal. Patients were strapped down, electricity coursing through their skulls, bones breaking from violent seizures. Many institutions used it not to heal, but to punish, to control unruly wards. And then there was lobotomy. At first, hailed as a miracle cure. A simple operation, they claimed, that could quiet the troubled mind. In reality, it was the theft of identity. Patients emerged vacant, their personalities erased. Thousands underwent the procedure. Some willingly, many not. But even these horrors pale beside the whispers of darker projects. In the 1950s, during the height of the Cold War, the CIA launched MKUltra program aimed at controlling the human mind. The records, declassified in part decades later, show experiments with LSD, hypnosis, and sensory manipulation. While most Americans assume these took place in controlled government labs, evidence suggests otherwise. Asylums offered the perfect testing ground. Anonymous populations, restricted access, administrations willing to cooperate in exchange for funding. Scattered documents hint at this connection. Invoices for large quantities of psychoactive drugs, shipped to institutions that had no clinical need for them. Payments listed under vague research grants. Handwritten notes from doctors referring to outside directives for experimentation. And then there are the testimonies. One nurse, interviewed in the 1970s, recalled watching men in suits arrive with unmarked boxes. Patients were selected without explanation, often those without families. They were taken to the basement, she whispered, and when they came back, they weren't the same. Some couldn't speak, some shook constantly. Some never came back at all. Another source, a former patient, described being given pills that caused vivid hallucinations. They said it was medicine, but I saw colors dripping from the walls, heard voices that weren't there. They laughed when I screamed. They wrote everything down. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from a 1963 memo found in state archives. Addressed to a superintendent, it reads, "The subjects have shown limited responsiveness to repeated administrations. Recommend transfer of non-viables to disposal. Maintain silence with families. Funding contingent on discretion. Transfer of non-viables. A clinical phrase, masking a chilling truth. Patients who did not respond as expected were discarded. If this sounds too monstrous to believe, consider what we now know about government-sanctioned experiments on the unsuspecting. Prisoners injected with radioactive isotopes. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas without consent. The Tuskegee study, where black men were denied treatment for syphilis just to watch the disease progress. History has proven that human lives were sacrificed in the name of research. Why would the asylums be any different? The missing patients fit the pattern. Those without advocates. Those deemed troublesome. Those society had already abandoned. The experiments were not limited to chemicals and shocks. Files hint at sensory torture patients left in complete darkness for days, subjected to deafening noise, deprived of food and sleep. One account describes a chamber where patients were strapped to chairs under constant flashing lights. A cruel attempt to break the mind. In another case, patients were injected with unknown serums, told it was medicine. Hours later, they writhed in pain, hallucinated, screamed until their throats bled. Nurses begged doctors to stop. The doctors replied that the data was too important. The asylum basements became laboratories of human suffering. And yet, so little remains on paper. Many records were destroyed in the 1970s when lawsuits began to rise. Entire archives burned accidentally. Boxes of files misplaced. But fragments survived: scraps of correspondence, mislabeled boxes, forgotten notes tucked in the nave. Back of drawers. Together, these fragments tell a horrifying story. The vanished patients were not simply lost. They were consumed by experiments the world was never meant to know. Some of the most chilling discoveries have come not from documents, but from the buildings themselves. Urban explorers who ventured into abandoned asylums reported rooms that looked nothing like hospital wards. Rooms with chains bolted to the floors, with chairs fitted with straps and crude wiring, with glass bottles labeled in faded handwriting. Subject A13, dosage 5 milligrams. These were not the tools of healing. They were the tools of control. And when divers searched beneath the drained basements of one Midwestern asylum in the 1990s, they discovered metal canisters sealed with wax. Inside were vials of liquid, still faintly glowing in the dark. Tests revealed traces of psychoactive compounds, chemicals linked to MKULTRA. This was the smoking gun. Proof that what happened inside was not just cruel, but coordinated. The truth is that the asylums became an invisible battlefield of the Cold War. While the public feared spies and missiles, the government pursued control of the human mind. And the asylums, the silent, forgotten institutions, were the front lines. The cost was human lives. Lives erased, experimented upon, discarded when they no longer proved useful. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: we still do not know the full extent. So many files were destroyed, so many testimonies silenced, so many graves unmarked, but the shadows left behind are undeniable. Walk through an abandoned asylum today, and you may stumble upon remnants of these horrors. Rusted gurneys, broken restraints, glass bottles still sealed with unknown contents. Each relic whispers of the lives consumed within those walls. And somewhere, beneath the silence, lies the memory of those patients, erased from ledgers, stripped from their families, sacrificed in the name of progress. The vanished patients were not just forgotten. They were taken, and their suffering would lead to the next chapter in this story, the Great Cover-Up. The story of the asylums cannot be told without addressing the vast machinery of silence that surrounded them. For while the experiments and disappearances were horrifying, they might have been exposed had it not been for the calculated cover-ups that followed Every missing patient meant a family left without answers. But every inquiry was met with a wall of bureaucracy. Letters went unanswered. Requests for visitation were denied. When families pressed harder, they were told the same. Refrain. Your loved one has been transferred, or the records are incomplete. The cover-up began small. A nurse's log quietly rewritten. A death certificate hastily filled in with vague causes. Natural causes, respiratory failure, sudden collapse. Terms that gave no hint of the true circumstances. Soon, the practice became systemic. Whole archives disappeared. Files shredded in the dead of night. Patient registers altered, with names removed or reassigned. Inspectors who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned, pressured into silence, or mysteriously retired. One of the most infamous cases came from an asylum in Pennsylvania. In 1967, a group of families demanded access to medical records. After hearing rumors of strange treatments, what they received were stacks of papers, every page identical, photocopies of a single transfer notice, stamped repeatedly with different dates. When challenged, the administration insisted the records had been misfiled and promised to locate the originals. They never did. Behind closed doors, directors spoke of mitigating liability and maintaining the integrity of the institution. What they meant was avoiding lawsuits, public outrage, and the collapse of funding. To admit the truth would have been to admit murder, and so the erasure deepened. Government agencies were complicit, whether through neglect or deliberate participation. State health departments, tasked with oversight, often looked the other way. Reports of abuse were minimized. Inspections were announced months in advance, allowing asylums to clean up or conceal their worst practices. Federal authorities played an even larger role. Declassified documents reveal a trail of correspondence between mental institutions and government research offices. When questions arose about missing patients, official memos ordered containment of inquiry. In one letter, a state director was instructed, "Do not escalate this matter to the press. Pending review, all responses to families should emphasize natural attrition and standard medical outcomes." The phrase natural attrition became a weapon. It implied patients had simply died due to the expected course of mental illness, old age, or frailty. It excused everything, and it gave grieving families no grounds to suspect foul play. But some families did suspect, and some refused to be silenced. In 1972, a mother named Eleanor Hart went public with her story. Her daughter, committed at the age of 19, had vanished within months. For years, Eleanor was told the girl had been transferred. But when Eleanor traveled to the listed facility, they had no record of her. Her daughter had simply ceased to exist on paper. Eleanor contacted newspapers, senators, even the FBI. She demanded to know how a living person could vanish into a system designed to heal. For a brief moment, the story gained traction. Headlines asked, "Where are the missing patients?" But just as quickly, the flames were smothered. Editors received phone calls urging them to drop the story. Senators backed away. The FBI issued a brief statement. No evidence of wrongdoing has been found. Eleanor was left alone, labeled a grieving mother too distraught to accept the truth. She died in 1985, never knowing what really happened to her daughter. Stories like hers, not unique. Across the country, similar attempts to speak out were drowned in red tape, intimidation, and carefully crafted denials. Whistleblowers inside the asylums faced the harshest retaliation. Nurses who raised concerns found themselves discredited, accused of negligence or misconduct. Some lost their licenses. Others claimed to have been followed, harassed, even threatened. One anonymous letter from the 1960s reads, "I know what they are doing in the basement. I have seen the patients who do not return. If they find out I wrote this, I am finished. The letter was unsigned. A nurse's identity remains unknown. The financial incentives behind the cover-up were immense. Asylums received state funding based on patient numbers. Fewer patients on paper meant less money. But disappearing patients allowed administrations to maintain inflated headcounts while quietly removing problematic individuals from sight. In some cases, patients who no longer existed were still counted for years. Their names used to justify budgets. Meanwhile, the darker experiments conducted in partnership with government agencies required absolute silence. Exposure would not only destroy reputations, but reveal programs that were never meant to see daylight. And so, secrecy became policy. Even religious institutions were drawn into the web. Many asylums were run by or affiliated with churches, who had every incentive to protect their image. Reports of abuse were dismissed as exaggerations. Priests assured families their loved ones were at peace, even when no proof could be provided. The moral authority of the church became another shield against inquiry. The most chilling aspect of the cover-up is not what we know, but what we never will. For every file preserved, thousands more were destroyed. Fires that broke out accidentally in records rooms. Floods that mysteriously damaged only patient archives. Moving trucks seen carting away boxes in the dead of night. By the 1980s, lawsuits against asylums began to rise. Former patients who survived spoke of abuse, neglect, and experiments. Families demanded accountability. Yet time and again, the institutions claimed the records were gone. Without proof, cases were dismissed. Justice was denied. The cover-up extended even into modern times. When journalists in the 1990s attempted to investigate, they encountered stone walls. State officials claimed archives had been lost during building relocations. Others cited privacy laws, arguing that releasing old records would violate patient confidentiality. Even though those patients had been missing for decades. It was the perfect irony. Laws designed to protect the vulnerable were weaponized to hide what had been done to them. But fragments always survive. And sometimes fragments are enough. A single ledger, misplaced in a county archive, revealing 37 names crossed out with no explanation. A box of photographs, patients strapped into strange devices, labeled only with numbers. A letter from a superintendent to a state director. The visitors must not be allowed below ground level. Reinforced protocol. Each fragment adds to the mosaic of horror. And though the cover-up was vast, it was not perfect. The most disturbing implication is this. If so, much was hidden. What remains unknown? If so many voices were silenced, how many stories will never be told? The cover-up did more than erase the past. It denied closure to families. It denied justice to victims. It allowed the cycle to continue, decade after decade, and it left behind a haunting emptiness, an absence where truth should have been. Today, when researchers walk into abandoned asylums, they step into that emptiness. The peeling paint, the shattered windows, the silent corridors, all are monuments, not just to what happened, but to what was concealed. Every missing file is a story stolen. Every redacted page is a voice muted. Every burned archive is a crime. Buried in ash. The cover-up may have succeeded in hiding the full truth. But the silence it left behind speaks louder than words. And in that silence, another layer of mystery has taken hold, one not of government or medicine, but of the unexplained. For as these buildings emptied and fell into ruin, strange reports began to surface. Shadows in the halls, voices in the night, places where the air itself seemed charged with something unseen. The asylums had hidden the crimes of men. But had they also become home to something else? That question leads us into the next chapter, the whispers of the paranormal. When the last patients were gone and the wards fell silent, the asylums did not die. The buildings remained, their walls heavy with memories, their floors scarred by years of suffering. And in their emptiness, a new kind of story began to grow. Stories of shadows, of whispers, of things that had no place in the world of reason and science. It started with the night watchman. After many institutions closed in the 1970s and 1980s, security guards were hired to patrol the grounds and keep trespassers away. They were practical men, often ex-policemen or veterans. Yet even they reported strange occurrences. Doors slamming, without wind. Lights flickering in buildings without power. The sound of footsteps echoing in corridors long abandoned. Some guards quit after only a few nights. One wrote in his resignation letter, "I cannot explain the things I have seen here, but I will not stay another night in that place." Soon, the legends began to spread. Children dared each other to sneak inside. Amateur ghost hunters brought tape recorders, swearing they captured voices in the static. Paranormal investigators filmed television specials, their cameras catching fleeting shapes, sudden bursts of static, or equipment failing in ways that seemed impossible. But the stories went deeper than simple hauntings. Many claimed that the asylums were not just haunted by the dead, but by the very experiments and cover-ups that had taken place within them. That the violence and trauma had imprinted themselves onto the walls. That the buildings themselves had become vessels of pain. One infamous account comes from a team of urban explorers who entered the remains of an asylum in New England. They carried flashlights and cameras, documenting the decay. On the third floor, they found a row of locked doors, each marked with a patient number. Behind one, they swore they heard scratching slow, steady, like fingernails dragging across wood. When they opened the door, the room was empty. But carved into the wall were words that hadn't been there minutes before. "Don't leave me." Others have reported cold spots so intense their breath turned to frost, even in the heat of summer. Objects moving on their own. Disembodied screams echoing from wards where patients were once restrained. Skeptics dismiss these tales as tricks of the mind fueled by fear and suggestion. They point out that old buildings creak, drafts whistle, and imaginations run wild in the dark. But those who have stood in those halls swear there is something more. And sometimes the stories are too precise to ignore. In the ruins of a Midwestern asylum, multiple visitors independently described the same figure. A woman in a hospital gown, her face obscured by tangled hair, standing at the end of a hallway. She never moved, never spoke. But when anyone tried to approach, she would vanish. Years later, when records from the asylum surfaced, researchers found a note about a patient who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Described by staff as a young woman with long, dark hair, always wandering the corridors. Coincidence? Perhaps, but such coincidences repeat again and again. Psychologists call it residual energy. Paranormal researchers call it haunting. Families call it justice. Whatever the name, the idea is simple. When trauma is intense enough, it leaves an imprint, replaying itself like a broken record. But some accounts suggest more than repetition. Some suggest intelligence. In the early 2000s, a group of paranormal investigators spent the night in the basement of a closed asylum. They asked questions into the darkness, leaving space for replies. On playback, a voice was heard, raspy, weak, but clear enough to say, "Still here." Others have captured answers that seem specific, even personal. Names, dates, fragments of pleas. A chilling reminder that silence does not always mean absence. The whispers of the paranormal are not confined to the United States. Across Europe, abandoned psychiatric hospitals tell the same stories. In Italy, the island asylum of Poveglia is said to echo with cries from patients burned in its crematorium. In the UK, the sprawling corridors of Denbigh Asylum are rumored to house figures that vanish when approached. In Germany, witnesses at the Belitz-Heilstätten complex report hearing children singing in wards where no child has been for decades. Why do these places, more than others, seem to hold on to the past? Some say it is because of the sheer volume of suffering within their walls. Others believe the secret experiments, the drugs, the shocks, the sensory deprivation opened doorways that were never meant to be opened. That the minds of patients were not the only things fractured in those rooms. The cover-ups and denials only add to the mystery. For every file destroyed, every truth hidden, the unknown grows larger. Paranormal investigators argue that secrecy feeds energy, giving rise to stronger manifestations. The more the world tries to erase, the more the walls refuse to forget. And then there are the photographs. Visitors have taken pictures in empty wards, only to discover faces staring back from the windows. A child's outline in a hallway where no children were kept. A shadow standing behind the photographer, though no one else was present. Skeptics cry hoax, and perhaps some are, but not all. Too many come from ordinary visitors, people with nothing, to gain by fabricating a ghost. For the families of the vanished, these stories bring both fear and comfort. Fear that their loved ones are trapped in eternal unrest. Comfort in the thought that, in some form, they still remain. The paranormal whispers also serve another purpose. They keep the memory alive. For even if the cover-ups erased names and burned records, the echoes in those buildings refuse to be silenced. They are reminders carved into stone and air, testaments that cannot be redacted. Some researchers argue that these stories are not supernatural at all, but psychological. That when people step into spaces where cruelty was routine, they unconsciously recreate the suffering, feeling what the patients once felt. That the voices and shadows are their own fears, projected onto the ruins. But even if that is true, the effect is the same. The asylums remain haunted, by ghosts or by memory, by the dead or by the living imagination. Haunted nonetheless. One cannot walk their corridors without sensing it. The weight, the silence that presses down, as though waiting for something to break it. The feeling of being watched, though no eyes are there. The whispers of the paranormal have transformed these ruins into something more than abandoned buildings. They are now monuments of both history and legend, places where the rational and the irrational blur, where silence speaks, and yet they are not frozen. They continue to change, to decay, to collapse. The structures that once hid secrets now crumble under time. And with every brick that falls, with every roof that caves in, more of the past is lost forever. But before they vanish completely, their final chapter must be told, the story of their collapse, abandonment, and the eerie afterlife that followed. By the late 20th century, the great asylums of America and Europe had reached their end. What had begun as noble institutions built with red brick, high ceilings, and open courtyards to heal the mind had turned into warehouses of human suffering. The pressure to close them had been building for decades, and finally, the collapse came. The first cracks appeared in the 1950s and 60s. Newspapers exposed abuses. Journalists smuggled cameras into wards to capture the truth. Citizens saw often, for the first time, the overcrowded conditions. Dozens of patients crammed into single rooms, lying on floors, restrained to beds. The public was horrified. By the 1970s, political leaders promised reform. Deinstitutionalization became the word of the day. Patients, they said, should no longer be hidden away in crumbling buildings. They should be treated in the community, closer to their families. Civil rights advocates agreed, insisting that keeping people locked in remote institutions was a violation of human dignity. And so, The doors began to close. At first, the idea seemed hopeful. Smaller group homes were planned. Outpatient treatment centers were promised, but the funding never matched the rhetoric. For every asylum that shut its gates, thousands of patients were released into systems unprepared to handle them. Some found families. Others found themselves on the streets. The story of deinstitutionalization is one of both liberation and abandonment. Inside the institutions, those who remained saw the decay firsthand. Budgets shrank. Staff were cut. Buildings fell into disrepair. Rain leaked through roofs. Mold spread through halls. Heating systems failed. Once proud structures became ghostly shells even before the last patient was moved. Then came the closures themselves. One by one, the great asylums shut their doors. Wards were emptied. Keys were turned in locks for the final time. The sound of silence settled where once there had been constant noise. No more footsteps of nurses. No more cries of patients. Only the creak of settling wood and the sigh of the wind through broken windows. What to do with these massive structures became the next question. Some were demolished outright, bulldozed into rubble, their history buried beneath new developments. Shopping centers, condominiums, office parks. The land was too valuable to leave untouched, but others remained standing, too vast and expensive to tear down. They lingered as hollow giants, their walls slowly crumbling, their roofs collapsing, their grounds overrun with weeds. Windows shattered, doors sagged, vines climbed the bricks. Inside, rust spread over metal fixtures. Paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips, and the smell of rot replaced the sterile scent of antiseptic. Explorers came next. First, it was local kids, daring each other to step inside. Then it was photographers, drawn by the haunting beauty of decay. Soon, an entire movement arose: urban explorers, or urbex enthusiasts who made pilgrimages to the ruins of the asylums. They documented peeling paint, collapsing hallways, forgotten wheelchairs, surgical instruments left behind. Their photos spread across the internet, giving millions of strangers glimpses into the forgotten corridors. For some, it was art. For others, it was horror. For many, it was both. But the explorers also uncovered darker remnants. Patient files left scattered on the floor. Cabinets filled with medical records that were supposed to have been destroyed. Journals, photographs, even preserved. Specimens jars of brains and organs labeled with numbers instead of names. Each discovery reminded the world of the human cost hidden in those halls. As time passed, the asylums became sites of debate. Preservationists argued they should be maintained as historical monuments, reminders of an era we should never return. 2. Developers insisted they were dangerous eyesores that wasted land. Paranormal enthusiasts lobbied to keep them standing, claiming the spirits of the past demanded respect. The truth is, many governments and institutions preferred destruction. Demolishing the buildings erased the evidence. Tearing them down meant no more trespassers, no more lawsuits, no more reminders of what had happened. With every wrecking ball swing, another piece of history was silenced, yet some still survive. Across the United States, the shells of Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, and others remain. In Europe, the ruins of Denbigh in Wales or Hellingly in England still stand, their roofs caving, their walls crumbling. They are relics, visited by those who seek the eerie beauty of forgotten places. The collapse of the asylums also reshaped communities. Towns that had once relied on them for jobs saw unemployment rise. Local economies withered. Buildings that had dominated skylines for generations suddenly became empty scars. Residents who had once whispered about the strange lights in the windows now spoke of demolition crews and redevelopment plans. But the abandonment left deeper wounds than just economic ones. For the families of those who vanished, the closure of the asylums felt like a final betrayal. Records were lost in the shuffle. Graves went unmarked. Patient belongings disappeared into storage or were thrown away. Generations of suffering were swept aside as though they had never existed. And yet the buildings refuse to be forgotten. They remain in photographs, in films, in whispered tales. Some have been repurposed into luxury apartments, schools, museums. But even in their new forms, the weight of the past lingers. Residents of converted apartments report uneasy feelings, strange sounds, unexplained movements. Museums built in former asylums struggle to balance education with the haunting legacy. Of the walls around them, the abandonment also brought new dangers. Fires broke out, often started by vandals. Roofs collapsed, injuring trespassers. Toxic mold spread through the walls. Lead paint and asbestos poisoned the air. Each visit into the ruins became a gamble, not just with fear, but with safety. Yet still, people entered, drawn by curiosity, by the thrill of trespass, by the unshakable feeling that within those walls, history was still alive, not in many ways. The collapse of the asylums mirrors the collapse of society's willingness to face the uncomfortable truths of mental illness. The buildings were closed, but the suffering they housed did not disappear. Patients were moved, but the systems that failed them remained broken. The ghosts of the institutions live on not only in legend, but in the continued struggles of those. Society still does not fully see Dot as the ruins crumble. They raise a haunting question. Is forgetting a form of mercy or a form of denial? Are we honoring the victims by erasing the places of their suffering, or condemning them to be lost a second time? The story of collapse and abandonment is not just about buildings. It is about memory. It is about how we choose to face the darkest chapters of our past, or how we choose to turn away, and as the ruins stand or fall, the whispers of the patients remain. In broken glass, in rusted beds, in the silent corridors where no footsteps echo, yet the air feels heavy with presence. The asylums may crumble into dust, but the memory of what they were refuses to be buried not, and so their story continues into the present day, into the echoes that still shape how we see mental health, how we face the shadows of our history, and how we remember the ones who vanished behind those locked doors. Today, long after the locks have rusted and the walls have begun to crumble, the echoes of the asylum still reach us. They rise from old records, from surviving patients and their families, from explorers who walk the ruins, and from historians who sift through what remains. The past has not disappeared. It lingers sometimes quietly, sometimes with a piercing clarity that cannot be ignored. In towns where great asylums once dominated the horizon, their memory is woven into the fabric of daily life. Street names, local legends, the ruins themselves, these things remind residents of what stood there. Some towns have embraced this legacy, building museums and memorials to honor those who lived and died behind asylum walls. Others prefer silence, avoiding the subject, as though speaking of it might summon ghosts. Modern historians have pieced together what they can from fragmented archives. Government files, once classified, have been declassified, revealing patterns of abuse, experimentation, and neglect. Yet many questions remain unanswered. Files were destroyed, either intentionally or through negligence. Whole decades of patient records vanished during the process of deinstitutionalization. Families searching for answers often find only silence, but not all traces are gone. Across Europe and the United States, medical libraries still contain forgotten boxes of documents patient, journals, photographs, even letters never delivered. Some of these reveal heartbreak in the patient's own words. Pleas for release, descriptions of conditions, prayers for someone to remember them. For the first time, those voices are being read aloud by researchers who refuse to let them fade away. The echoes also persist in culture. Films, novels, television series all return to the asylum as a setting of horror and mystery. While popular media often exaggerates, it also keeps the memory alive. Audiences are drawn to the idea of the asylum, not just because it is frightening, but because it is real. The walls that appear in horror films are often the same walls where real patients once lived. The line between fact and fiction blurs, and in that blur, the echoes grow louder. Paranormal investigators, too, have made the abandoned asylums into pilgrimage sites. Groups armed with cameras and recorders spend long nights in the ruins claiming to hear voices, footsteps, cries. Skeptics dismiss this as imagination or suggestion, but believers argue that the suffering imprinted itself into the walls. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, the presence of these investigations reveals something undeniable. The world still feels haunted by what happened there. And then there are the families, the sons and daughters, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews who still search. Some never knew their relatives were in asylums until they uncovered a record, a death certificate, or a gravestone in a forgotten cemetery. For them, the echoes are personal. They are not stories for books or films. They are wounds still felt generations later. In some cases, families have begun to reclaim the memory of their relatives. Graves once marked only by numbers have been given names. Ceremonies have been held at former asylums, prayers offered, candles lit. Survivors, too, have begun to speak. A few who endured the final years of institutionalization have shared their stories publicly, describing what it was like to live inside walls that never let them leave. Their testimonies are perhaps the most powerful echoes of all. Today's mental health systems still struggle, shaped by the legacy of those institutions. While modern treatment is far more humane, challenges remain. Underfunding, stigma, and neglect still echo the old patterns, though in different forms. The ghosts of the asylums remind us not to turn away, not to repeat the same mistakes. The ruins themselves continue to bear witness. In some places, they have been transformed into museums, where guided tours walk visitors through preserved wards, showing them the stark cells, the locked doors, the treatment rooms. These museums serve as warnings, reminders of what happens when society hides its most vulnerable. In other places, the ruins are playgrounds for explorers, or canvases for graffiti, or shelters for the homeless. Each use reflects the way society continues to wrestle with what these places mean. And then there is silence. In many towns, the asylum is gone, erased completely. A shopping mall now stands where thousands once lived. A suburban neighborhood spreads across fields where patients were buried in unmarked graves. Few of the new residents know what their homes were built upon. The silence itself becomes an echo, a reminder that forgetting can sometimes be as haunting as remembering. But the most chilling echoes are not in the ruins or the records. They are in the questions that remain. What happened to the patients? Who vanished and were never found? What secrets were buried when files were burned, when walls were sealed, when tunnels were filled? How many families still live without knowing the truth of what happened to their relatives? The story of the asylums is not over. It cannot be over because too much remains unresolved. Every time a forgotten record is found, every time an explorer steps into a dark hallway and shines a light on what was left behind, the past speaks again. Every time a descendant demands answers, the silence is broken. The echoes remind us of a simple truth. Societies are judged not by how they treat the strong, but by how they treat the vulnerable. The asylums stand as monuments to what happens when the vulnerable are hidden, silenced, and erased. They are warnings carved into brick and stone, warnings we cannot afford to ignore. And so, as the ruins collapse and fade, as the silence deepens, we are left with a choice: to listen to the echoes, to honor the voices of those who are lost, to remember even when remembering is uncomfortable, because if we do not, the past will not stay buried. It will return in the whispers of the abandoned halls, in the flicker of light in a broken window, in the quiet knowledge that history always waits for us to face it. This is not just the story of the asylums. It is the story of memory itself. It is the story of how the forgotten demand to be heard. And it is a story that continues to echo today and always. Asterisk, asterisk, the past never stays silent. Keep listening. Subscribe for more untold stories.